I remember watching this video a few years ago when I wasn't even a socialist. At the time, when my political knowledge came mainly from memes and my political literature readings were almost non-existent, and thinking to myself, what a ridiculous country where one family is able to fool the entire nation into becoming drug addicts and profiting billions from it. But how naive I was. I didn't realize that where I'm from, there's a similar problem. And it's not about some specific family, it is about the entire system. But please, don't get me wrong. Despite realizing that the problem is systematic, I still believe that the majority of Sackler family should be put in prison, and all of the wealth expropriated and given to people who have suffered from the opioid addiction in the US. But the thing is that if we focus on a family or a corporation and blame our problems and the massive addiction of the Western population on them, nothing will change. Above every family, above every corporation, there is the system. If tomorrow we were to eliminate all the evil corporation, by the next day we will have a new bunch of evil corporation to substitute them. It's all about the system. As you might have understood by now, this small piece of propaganda is about how and why capitalism, more specifically neoliberalism, is turning us into a bunch of junkies by destroying our mental health while simultaneously making billions in profit. How is our mental health connected to our socioeconomical condition? But most importantly, what do our massive drug addiction and the unprecedented level of mental illness tell us about the society that we live in? Sit back, get a bunch of cancerous food, and enjoy this small video about one more screwed up thing in our society. As per usual, to talk vaguely about this topic, I need to introduce other and very relevant terms and conditions. Context, as they call it. Despite my very pessimistic views towards the future and the current state of society, I need to admit that medicine has progressed at an astonishing rate in the past centuries. Our life expectancy has accompanied that enormous increase. But at this point, I believe it's very important to demystify a very common myth pushed in our society. It is told to us that it was the Industrial Revolution that increased our life expectancy. This is partially true. The reality is that in the first decades of the Industrial Revolution, life expectancy actually decreased. Only after the first revolts and after the first winds of the workers' and socialist movements, which in turn led to a small increase in working condition, and as a consequence, a general life expectancy increase. Also, it was through the pressure of the working class that we, today, have such things as public healthcare. Except if you live in the US, of course. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these factors solely contributed to the increase in life expectancy, but this important one, and is one that is very often and purposely forgotten. Still, that's just a side note. Nonetheless, medicine has been evolving. We are achieving incredible milestones in terms of what medicine can do. From pediatry to brain tumors, we are doing things that at other times would be considered impossible, curing and extinguishing more disease and illnesses than ever. Sadly, the same could not be said about mental health diseases, which have been increasing at an alarming and exponential rate since the 70s, which act as a counter-trend to the general medicine, showing worse results than in the 70s. Today, 1 in every 5 adults in the UK and 1 in every 4 in the US are prescribed psychiatric drugs by the physician. And these people are the extreme on the mental illness spectrum, because if we expand the spectrum to a broader one, 1 billion people in the West are suffering from a mental disorder at this moment in time, according to UN studies. So, if you are watching this and you are from the West, I congratulate you. You are an unhappy owner of a mental disorder. And of course, all of this is accompanied by a massive increase in profits for the pharmaceutical companies. Being the main question, of course, how did we got here? At this point, it would be foolish to deny that we live in a commodity-based world. Everything around us is a commodity, and what is not will eventually be turned into one. Even ideas. We live to buy commodities. At this point, our primary function as individuals is to respond to imposed desires and buy some more commodities. We are offered solutions to problems we didn't even know we had. In many cases, we didn't even have them. They are nothing more than simulacrums of problems, artificially created in order to sell us something. Whole industries have thrived on the basis of this logic, offering self-interesting explanation and solution for many pains of our existence as self-aware apes. The cosmetic industry locates our misery in our aging, the diet industry in our body imperfection, the fashion industry in our lack of confidence, and of course the pharmaceutical industry in our so-called faulty brain deficits. All of them seriously contribute to the creation of a problem and offer us a solution. In many cases, this solution precedes the problem itself. Each industry offers its own profitable elixir for our emotional success, while in reality, all they do is share and promote the same consumerism philosophy of suffering. Our society doesn't teach us how to deal with and engage with natural problems as aging, grief, sadness, etc. On the contrary, we are taught that all we need to do to resolve our problems is to consume more. Despite this kind of commodity fetishism being part of capitalist society from its origins, things got significantly worse after the 80s of the last century, with the mass implementation of neoliberalism as the primary form of politics in the Western world. Let's thank Reagan's and Thatcher's of the world for that. Although, I need to make a small disclaimer here. Despite Reagan and Thatcher being the main faces of neoliberalism and responsible for its implementation in our society, it was not invented by them. It was invented and heavily pushed by a variety of think tanks since the 50s. There are numerous videos explaining what neoliberalism is. Just don't check the ones from the big media, they're other garbage. I mainly recommend one video from Bad Empanada. In my opinion, it's one of the best, mainly because it gives a lot of material context to neoliberalism. But in the context of this video, we should assume neoliberalism as an ideology that on one hand has a childish belief that the market can fix any social problem, and on the other is an extremely individualistic ideology. So it puts all the responsibility on the individual, considering all the socioeconomical factors almost irrelevant. That applies directly to our mental health. We blame suffering on our faulty minds and brains rather than our socio-political environment, which is very useful for our current politics. It is kind of the same discourse as if you were homeless or poor when they say it's your fault, and nobody besides you can change it. Things that you might have heard from people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, and other individual blaming and capitalist champions. Those guys are just saying what the governments are already doing. Being the main problem, the fact that we don't stop and think about why our pharmaceutical companies' profits are going up while mental health care problems seems to get worse and worse. And maybe this kind of scenario is even holding us back as humanity. Capitalism, in other words, inflicts a double injury on the depressed people. First, it causes or contributes to a state of depression. Second, it erases any form of causality and individualizes the illness, so that it appears as if the depression in question is a personal problem. In many cases, it appears to be your own fault. If you had just lived a better or more active life, made other choices, and had more positive mindset, then you will not be depressed. This is sung by many coaches around the world, therapists, psychoanalysts, and pharmaceutical companies. Happiness is your choice, your responsibility. The same goes for unhappiness and depression. Capitalism makes us feel bad, and then, to add, insult the injury, makes us feel bad about feeling bad. Because in the end, within their logic, if an individual is responsible for their own happiness, then they are also responsible for their own unhappiness. If the keys are in your hands, each of us is personally responsible for almost everything. Success or failure, health or illness, are a matter of subjective willpower, lifestyle, and choices alone. This is the main talking point that's imposed to us by the current system. Let's go back to the main demon in the room, mental health, and how neoliberalism and the pro-market agenda has harmed us. How its approach to mental health issues has turned into something that ended up sedating, depoliticizing our discontent, while keeping us productive as subject to the current economical status quo. we have fought to accept and endure, rather to stand up and challenge the socio-economical conditions that are destroying us. During the post-World War II period, we were living through a period which is called the post-war consensus. Basically, the Western government, out of fear of socialist revolts, start implementing heavy regulation and also heavily subsidizing and helping its own population through a bunch of state-financed programs, which heavily increased the quality of life of the majority of the population. It was at this time that the government created things like national healthcare systems, etc. It was one of the most equal periods in the Western world. Wages went up, social and civil liberties expanded, social mobility became more than just a myth, unemployment almost disappeared, and scientific and technological innovation grew up exponentially. These policies were benefiting the working class and the poor, but not the companies and the wealthiest. So through decades of lobbying, we came to Reagans and Thatchers of the world. They believed that the government was doing too much and that harmed the general population. They believed that the market could do a better job than the government to resolve social problems. So for serious reforms, they tried to organize the government and its spendings as a market corporation, while simultaneously letting the market do its own thing, unchecked and uncontrolled. This, in turn, resulted in the world that we have today. And just as a side fun note, to show that the world is not without its own irony, one of the main arguments for the implementation of neoliberalism was to reduce state bureaucracy. But by organizing the government as a corporation, the exact opposite happened. We now have the biggest bureaucratic apparatus ever. This mass liberalization of the economies had a disastrous effect. Unemployment and wealth inequality, food and electricity shortages, and other societal problems had all grown exponentially. But neoliberalism was not only about economics. With the implementation of neoliberalism, the final goal was also to create a new man, a man which main characteristics were competitiveness, self-reliance, entrepreneurialism, productivity, and ambition. The main problem for the arrival of this new man was the state and the population reliance on the state. From now on, the state would conduct a massive campaign of privatization of previously public-owned companies. It will reduce its role in the economy, while corporations will be given more and more privilege and subsidies. Welfare and social protection programs would be cut. The only public sector that didn't suffer from the cut was the security and police sector. On the contrary, it expanded as never seen before, which kinda made sense, because the government knew that the working class would not accept it peacefully, which they didn't, as we have seen in massive strikes in the 80s and around the world. Many say that at that moment was the last time that the working class fought back, which is kind of true. As a result of these economical policies, we are now living in a similar condition that people lived in the 1900s. But now we call it the gig economy, a form of a job where basically the only benefit that the worker have is to be exploited. But at least we have phones and shiny things. From a neoliberal point of view, we can say that they were successful in dismantling the working class organized power and our general sense of community. Unions fell by more than half, and in the US they almost got extinct, with only now, in 2020s, we are experiencing reinsurance in unions in the US. They imposed on us an individualistic point of view of the world, merely through the vast enforcement of policies and a new form of education, and most importantly, language and terms that we start using. We abandoned our dreams of a better world for us and our community, and embraced the status of the proud homeowner or temporarily embraced millionaire. The transformation of society and the mass privatization and deregulation led to a flourishing new industry, the pharma industry. In the 70s and 80s, the massive deregulation of the pharmacy industries were mainly the result of decades of massive lobbying, with the main argument being the fact that it will bring massive innovation and advancement to the field, and the rest of the population will benefit from it due to the fact that drugs will become cheaper, which by looking to today, we know that is nothing more than smoke and mirror. Nonetheless, they succeeded in making the government almost completely deregulate them, and with aggressive marketing, they succeeded to hook up us on their drugs. The sad fact is that the majority of studies are made by those companies, so they decide what mental illness is and what is not. They decide what requires medication and what doesn't, and as a result, today we have a massive opioid crisis. We live in a society where we had put economic certitude above real individuals and our individual mental health and its flourishing. We had conceptualized our suffering in ways that protect the current economic system from criticism, in a similar capacity that in the beginning of capitalism, Christianity was used. We are told that our suffering is rooted in individuals and not in our environment. Despite neoliberalism being proven a failure on every front, we still believe that our mental health problems are our own faults, of our faulty brains, and not of our economical condition that we are experiencing. Mental illness was reduced to just a natural condition of life, purely natural chemical imbalance in the brain, which requires a chemical solution, and then turn that suffering into a vibrant market opportunity for more consumption. Since 1990s, the private pharmaceutical industry has been a major sponsor of the Western psychiatric research, which allows them to heavily influence the result. This has enabled companies to literally create a paradigm that favors the economical interest, which in turn resulted in a $70 billion profit only in 2021 alone. They are doing this by making dubious research, medical malpractice, and other shady things designed to legitimize their products. We have multiple instances where pharmaceutical companies were literally caught on manipulating data, boosting effectiveness, hiding inconvenient harms, and offering media a monetary incentive, while simultaneously using a deceiving and aggressive marketing campaign, all in for the profit, as they say. Basically, they created discourse around the mental health. Every time we have an independent research or government-funded research, we discovered a completely new story, a story that we are quickly forced to forget, only because it doesn't benefit the system. Like when recently, through independent research, it had been proven that there is no direct link between serotonin level and depression. This finding was almost nowhere to be seen, mainly because it contradicts the paradigm, the myths about the chemical imbalance. Mark Fisher characterized this paradigm very well in his book called Capitalism Realism, and I want to quote him right now because I think his quote is perfect. It goes without saying that all mental illness are neurologically initiated, but this says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin level, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of the repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one, if the left wants to challenge the capitalism realism. These questions are almost never asked, mainly because that would make us analyze our environment and realize that the result of our depression is our socioeconomic environment, the daily exploitation that the majority of us suffer, and the complete transformation of the individual into a commodity or commodity consumer, and nothing more. Too many uncomfortable questions that will challenge the status quo. But don't get me wrong, capitalism itself is responsible for the majority of mental health issues that we are experiencing, and the pharmaceutical companies are making it even worse. Their action resulted in a world where since the 80s, the global mental health industries have been growing up exponentially, and at the same time, the number of people with mental health also has grown exponentially. But that doesn't end there, because according to World Health Organization, around 800,000 people are taking their lives due to depression every year. And we also have people who get addicted to heroin. Like 70% of heroin addicts in the US first started with a prescribed opioid drug. We are living in a mental health crisis at this point, and the massive privatization of health industry is making things only worse. As an individual who personally has gone through some mental health problems, and who has very close people in a similar position, things are not looking very good, to be honest. Especially now that we are going to be the first generation that's going to live worse than the previous one. when we are experiencing massive inflation, massive climate catastrophe, war, and things will probably even get worse. So it's not surprised that our mental health situation will only get worse. Also due to the fact that there is no real effort to systematically change things. For the contrary, the current system is making things even worse. We are living in a mental health crisis at this point, and the massive privatization of health industry is making things only worse. As an individual who personally has gone through some mental health problems, and who has very close people in a similar position, things are not looking very good, to be honest. Especially now that we are going to be the first generation that's going to live worse than the previous one. When we are experiencing massive inflation, massive climate catastrophe, war, and things will probably even get worse. So it's not surprised that our mental health situation will only get worse. Also due to the fact that there is no real effort to systematically change things. For the contrary, the current system is making things even worse. There is not much that we as individuals could do about the current situation, except neglect and ignore all the qualities imposed to us by neoliberal system. We have been told to be selfish, to focus on ourselves, to be competitive, to be productive, and to only blame ourselves for our failures. This is nothing than lies. Lies that we have been constantly sold by our society, by our schools, by our jobs, by our government. But in the end, they are nothing more than lies. Lies that are killing us, while someone's making billions in profit from them. I know that with the current state of things, where the big majority of the population is living paycheck to paycheck, however more and more people are about to cross the poverty line, or even get evicted from their homes, it's hard to say those things, and it's even harder to do them. More often than not, it's a matter of the world you live in, the work that you hate, the job that you just lost, the debt that haunts your present and your future, or the fact that the planet's future is still going down the drain. But it is at this moment that we should rejoin our communities and our close ones, because we are not alone in this fight against individualism, neoliberalism, and capitalism. All systems that had failed us, so we should abandon them, at least on a personal level. The sad reality is that this is the only thing that we could possibly do. Because to make real change, a real improvement to our mental health crisis, we need a severe and hardcore change. We need to nationalize our mental health issues. We need to highly regulate pharmaceutical companies, while simultaneously remaking our economies and our institutions. Sadly, I don't see any prospect of this thing happening anytime soon. On a more personal level, I also highly recommend the reading of two books. The first one is called Sedated, How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. And the second one, Capitalism Realism, by Mark Fisher, a person who suffered from depression and in the end, sadly, took his own life because of it. His overview is an ongoing meditation on depression as a personal experience and a social-political experience. In the book Capitalism Realism, he connected depression to capitalism realism, which basically is the widespread sense that not only capitalism is the only viable political and economical system, but also that it is now impossible to even imagine a coherent alternative to it. And this book, depression becomes a paradigm of case of how capitalism realism operates, a symptom of our blocked and bleak historical situation. I also recommend an essay by him, which is called The Privatization of Stress, from 2011. Those two books will give you much deeper insight into everything I just talked about, and may even help you, and maybe personally help you live a better life. At least in my case, they helped. Not much, but they did, because I don't agree with the statement that ignorance is bliss. You feel the oppression of the system, even if you don't know about it. But if you will know about it, at least it will help you manage the things a little bit better. So we came to the conclusion of this video. If you believe that my content deserves consider becoming a Patreon or leaving a like and subscribe. It's been a very, very hard video to make, to be honest, especially because, as I mentioned, I also suffer from some complicated mental health problems, so it's a very, very personal topic to me. And I highly recommend, if you're listening to this, maybe like you kind of like care about what I'm going to say, so I really highly recommend you reading those two books. In my situation, they really, really helped me a lot, and I hope they could do for you the same that they did for me. Thank you once again for watching, and take care.